Sonia plans to sell a piece of art for $12,500. She wants the money to be paid off in two ways: a short term note at 12% interest and a long term note at 9% interest. Find the amount of each note if the total annual interest paid is $1,260. So, when we have word problems, the first thing we need to do is assign variables, and the variables come directly from the question that's being asked. We're being asked to find the amount of each note. So two different notes. So we could potentially use two different variables. And so looking at the problem, we notice we do have enough information to come up with two different variables. We have information on the loan amount. We also have information on the interest amount. So we could use two different equations, two different variables, and solve them as a system of equations. So call your variables X and Y, call them A and B, call them whatever you want to call them. But we want to very carefully and clearly label what those variables are. That will help us in knowing what information we have and what information we're looking for. And so if we're going to call them X and Y, then we can let X be, notice we're asked to find the amount of each note, how much money that note was for, how much money that loan was for. And so X and Y are going to be amounts of money. They're not going to be the interest, they're going to be the amounts of money. And so we can let X be the amount of money in the short term note. And then we can let Y be the amount of money in the long term note. And so now we know that X and Y are both amounts of money that were borrowed. And so we are told that the total she plans to sell this piece of art for is 12,500. And so some of that money is going to be X and some of that money is going to be Y. So the amount of the short-term note and the amount of the long-term note together have to be $12,500. So if we've labeled those carefully as amounts of money, then we know that those two amounts together add to the total amount. And so that's our first equation, that the amount of the short-term note plus the amount of the long-term note has to equal the total amount of money. So X plus Y has to equal 12,500, which means the other equation is going to deal with the interest. And so the interest, remember, is the interest times the amount times the time. This is annual interest, so the time is going to be 1 year for both. And so multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. So we kind of ignore the time and we just look at the interest rate times the amount that was in that loan. And that will tell us how much interest that loan earned in 1 year. And so for the short-term note, it had an interest rate of 12%. So changing that 12% to a decimal, we get 0.12, and we multiply that by the amount of money that was in that short-term note, which is what we called X. So 0.12 times that amount of money, 0.12 times X, is going to give us the amount of interest that was earned on the short-term note. Same thing for the long-term note. We're going to take the interest rate, so 9%. So we're going to change that to 0.09. And we're going to multiply that by how much money was in that account. And that's what we called Y. And so 0.09 times that amount, 0.09 times Y, tells us how much interest we earned off of the second account in 1 year. And we know that the total interest earned in 1 year was $1,260. So if we add those two amounts of interest together, they should total, the $1,260. So now we've got two equations with two variables. Once we've got those set up, we can solve using a system of equations. So we solve a system of equations either by substitution or elimination or the Gauss-Jordan matrices. There's lots of different ways to solve. I personally prefer elimination, so that's what I'm going to use. And so if I want to eliminate one of these variables, I can eliminate x by multiplying the first equation by a negative 0.12, so that when I add a negative 0.12x and a positive 0.12x, I get 0 x's, and the x's get eliminated. I can do the same thing to eliminate y by multiplying by a negative 0.09. So those are not the only options, but those are probably the easiest. I'm going to choose to multiply the top equation by a negative 0.12. And so when I do multiplying everything by negative 0.12, I get negative 0.12x minus 0.12y. And then when we multiply negative 0.12 times 12,500, we get negative 1,500. Now the bottom equation, I'm not changing. It's staying exactly the same. And then we're going to add these two equations together. And when we add them, negative 0.12x plus positive 0.12x does give us 0 x's. So x gets eliminated. Negative 0.12y plus 0.09y gives us 0.03y. And negative 1,500 plus 1,260, negative 1,500 plus 1,260 gives us a negative 240. Sorry, this should have been a negative 0.03y. Negative 0.12y plus positive 0.09y gives us a negative 0.03y. And negative 1,500 plus positive 1,260 gives us a negative 240. And so now we have just a y. We can solve this equation for y, divide both sides by a negative 0.03, and we get y is equal to positive 8,000. And so that tells us that 8,000 is y, and y was the amount of the long-term note. So we found that 8,000 is how much the long-term note was. To find out how much the short-term note was, well, remember that the short-term note plus the long-term note, which is 8,000, have to total 12,500. So 12,500 minus the 8,000 tells us that x is going to be 4,500. So our short-term note, x, was $4,500, and the amount of the long-term note was y, which was 8,000. So putting those into my math lab, the amount of the short-term note, that was x, that was 4,500. And the amount of the long-term note, that was y, so that was 8,000.